Okay, welcome everybody. I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce Yochai Benkler today. Yochai is a professor of entrepreneurial studies in the law school here at Harvard. He's also the co-director of the Berkman Center. It's really hard to encapsulate who Yochai is and the work he does in a short introduction. There is a theme that runs through it related to openness and related to freedom, but he's worked on this from so many different angles that it's really very dazzling. He's worked on decentralized collaboration in open networks and worked on the notion of what would it mean to be productive in that kind of open system. His book, The Wealth of Networks from 2006 has just been extremely well received by all kinds of people. He's very socially engaged. He recently received the Ford Foundation Visionaries Award as an example. Thinks very deeply about freedom in the press. Wanted to mention, I'm sure all of you know, but I wanted to mention and acknowledge the witnessing work he did in the Manning trial, where he did a great thing, and also he made this very interesting new narrative about how to think about technology in this new age and how it relates into the press. And then to throw one other thing out there, just to emphasize his breadth, he headed up a study that the Berkman Center produced with other people in this room who I see on internet broadband access globally and in the US, which was an important work in late 2009. And recently, he's been visible through The Guardian, writing articles about what's been going on with Edward Snowden and the NSA. So it's really an amazing pleasure to have him here. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much, David. It's great to be here. I'm going to abuse you a little bit by trying to throw at you, use the fact that it's a small setting, to throw at you a first rough draft of a set of ideas of how to connect what we're observing with NSA bulk surveillance and the response to Edward Snowden to a broader project of trying to understand freedom in the context of the multiple overlapping imperfect systems that we inhabit as people, and how that approach to understanding freedom is in conversation with more standard models of understanding freedom through liberal legality or libertarianism and market-oriented work or anarchism. So excuse the rough stitches. Let me know where the holes are so big that you really can't let me live with them. And I will talk for about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, I take it is more or less the norm. I understand people have to leave at 1. I will use that as an excuse not to take it personally. Let's go. So let's start at the beginning. The Inspector General's, 5 Inspector Generals report on the President's surveillance program, the so-called warrantless wireless tapping program that began in 2001, begins the story in this form. In the days immediately after September 11, 2001, the NSA used its existing authorities to gather intelligence information in response to the terrorist attacks. When Director of Central Intelligence Tenet, on behalf of the White House, asked NSA Director Hayden whether the NSA could do more against terrorism, Hayden replied that nothing more could be done within existing authorities. When asked what he might do with more authority, Hayden said he put together information on what was operationally useful and technologically feasible. This information formed the basis for the PSP, the President's surveillance programs. Shortly thereafter, the President authorized the NSA to undertake a number of new, highly classified intelligence activities. All of these activities were authorized in a single presidential authorization that was periodically reauthorized. That's the moment of transformation. And no image captures it more powerfully or more appropriately than this supposed image of the Information Awareness Office that came to represent the idea of total information awareness, And the image captures several things, but most importantly, it captures the idea of observation as the foundation of the projection of power. It captures the idea that surveillance is visibility for centers of power into target populations whose intention is to increase the capacity of the observer to control behavior and shape capabilities or outcomes. We understand in the historical context that bulk surveillance is seen as an imperative. We understand that it's intended to increase control and reduce unpredictability of catastrophic outcome. So it is in fact intended to achieve greater power in the hands of the observer. Critical here is to distinguish, and an effort is being made continuously to talk about this in a single framework with the naked society, everybody watching everybody else. But the critical thing is to distinguish transparency from surveillance, and the distinguishing feature is power and its location. And I'd like us to be able to use transparency as visibilities of subjective power to view the workings of the system in ways that permit them to avoid power or deploy counterpower. So there's no descriptive distinction between the two. You have to have a normative sense of, the descriptive sense of what power is, and then a normative sense of what counts as power that you can or can't resist. The story is an old one. This is the front matter from the Church Report from 1976. Let's look together at the contents of Book 2, which dealt with the counterintelligence. Introduction and summary. A, intelligence activity, a new form of governmental power to impair citizens' right. C, the summary of the main problems. 1, the number of people affected by domestic intelligence activity. 2, too much information is collected for too long. 3, covert action and the use of illegal or improper covert means. The FBI's COINTELPRO, that is to say counterintelligence against local advocacy groups, Martin Luther King. Illegal or improper means, mail opening, NSA monitoring, electronic surveillance, political abuse, etc. Adverse impact of improper intelligence, general efforts to discredit, media manipulation, distorting data to influence government policy and public perceptions, chilling First Amendment rights, preventing the free exchange of ideas. On page 21, we see the lesson, history repeats itself. So it would seem. What the Church Committee report tried to do, beyond describing the rise of what was then understood as the American surveillance state from the 1930s through the 1970s, was to begin to implement the model of freedom that liberal legality instantiates. That is to say, to put in place institutional changes, law, and organizational changes, bodies, like the FISC, that would together permit the behavior to continue with its functional attributes of secrecy and surveillance and visibility to achieve power, while containing that power through within legal system constraints. It's precisely to those features that the president then spoke when he responded to the first round of revelations and said, what you've got is 2 programs originally authorized by Congress, repeatedly authorized by Congress. These are programs that have been authorized by broad bipartisan majorities since 2006. Congress is continuously briefed on how it's conducted. There are a whole range of safeguards involved, and federal judges are overseeing the entire program throughout. Not only does the court authorize the initial gathering of data, but I want to repeat, if anybody wanted to go further than that, just top-line data, and wanted to, for example, listen to a journalist's phone call, they'd have to go back to a federal judge. Deep, deep reliance on these institutional mechanisms. And this is essentially the model of liberal legality and how it views freedom. Institutional and organizational interventions that contain power by instantiating components within the system that enables the power to begin with, the law, to contain it. The assumptions are factual, it is possible to do so, and normative, it is the way to contain the power of the state that preserves the state's legitimacy and its capacity to be the fundamental bedrock of rights and hence of freedom. It self-contains within the state. Well, let's look a little bit at reality. What's the relationship between that model and what happens? And let's start by layering over the set of programs we've learned about in the last few months. So let's start with Bull Run. What we see here from the secret budget that was leaked, the SIGINT enabling project actively engages the US and foreign IT industries to covertly influence and overtly leverage their commercial product designs. These design changes make the system in question exploitable through SIGINT collection with foreknowledge of the modification. To the consumer and other adversaries, however, the system security remains intact. So, for example, insert vulnerabilities into commercial encryption systems, IT system networks, and endpoint communication devices used by targets, and influence policies, standards, and specification for commercial public key technologies. So what we have here is an intervention at the standard setting and professional organization level, at the commercial product design level, to make the systems weaker. Now, none of this falls under FISA Amendments Act, none of this falls under Patriot Act, because none of this is surveillance. This is all systemic intervention. The oversight system is purely internal to the executive. To the extent that there's congressional oversight, it is purely through seeing the secret budget and those who do get to see it, under conditions that we've learned over the last few months are severely hampered in terms of their staffing. Can't take notes, can't bring in staff on any significant level, minimal level of exposure because of the classification system. Moreover, some of these interventions, because they're voluntary, make them completely irrelevant to judicial review. So you look at the core set of initial interventions, redesigning the standard setting system, the commercial product design system, none of that falls within that model of liberal legality. And what it does is to extend the hand of the state outside its prescribed boundaries and into these core enabling systems that we occupy elsewhere. Then we found out about muscular exploitation overseas in collaboration with GCSQ. Apparently what's used here is jurisdictional arbitrage to treat this access to full flow on the fly as foreign intelligence, which means it's not subject to the FISA Amendments Act. It's not subject to Patriot Act 215. It is subject only to Executive Order 12333, which, by Senator Feinstein's own admission, is a part of the work of the intelligence community that is least subject to oversight by the congressional system. As a practical matter, what you get here is collection of the internal connection points between Google and Yahoo's internal clouds and the rest of the net. As a practical matter, we haven't yet touched law. We haven't yet touched law and legality. And we already have the basic standards, the basic product design, and the basic flow of everything that goes over Google and Yahoo clouds. We haven't yet touched legality. The rest is cleanup. On top of that, we have the use of an internal legal memo changing the definition of what counts as appropriate analysis of metadata and how much you need to know that the particular piece belongs to a foreign subject before you do certain kinds of network analysis to identify network maps and do larger scale data analysis. And you see a shift in this particular internal memo from 2011 to a more permissive attitude. Again, this is purely internal to the executive. It may or may not be ultimately disclosed 2 or 3 years later in some form or another, as we'll see when we look at the pattern of the opinions. So now we have all of the flow using jurisdictional arbitrage, all of the intervention in the standards and product design, and the large-scale data analysis, still without touching the legal system in any effective way. Now, at long last, we come to some extent to the legal system, except for one really important hack. And that's Upstream Collection. This is a hypothetical rendition that the ACLU put together in a Eavesdropping 101 primer. The big hack here is the voluntariness of the program. That is to say, overwhelmingly, in the first few years, all of it more recently to some extent. The cooperation has been voluntary from the telcos, and we've seen, at least in the media reports, a real difference between the degree to which the telcos have accepted this as a basic part of their model versus the internet companies. But essentially what we get, because it's voluntary, or for several years, and I'll mention this in a little bit, under highly legally suspicious and weak models of exigent letters and the national security letters, what you got was either actually completely voluntary or quietly quiescent cooperation, which again excludes the legal system because there's no forcing mechanism to bring it in. So now we have capturing anything that ends on one end or looks like it ends on one end abroad, not only to or from a subject, but also about a subject or a selector. So very broad definition. So if we try to look on a timeline, and this is the period about which we know most because it was the period that was subject to an Inspectors General report from the Inspectors General of the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, CIA, NSA, and Office of Director of National Intelligence that was published in 2009 in response to a requirement in the 2008 FISA Amendments Act. What we see is that the formal legal mechanisms were invoked. So we see almost immediate reading in of the Gang of Eight in Congress. The idea of delegated oversight is that only a small number of members of Congress are read into programs, either the Senate Select Committee, the House Committee on Intelligence. In this particular case, it was even a subset of those, just the leadership of the two houses, and they let it go. There's an information to the presiding judge of the FISC, but no real requirement of answering. And there's a bringing in of the administrative anchor, the Department of Justice, through the request of certification by the Attorney General, which is then handed over to the Office of Legal Counsel, which historically provides an internally independent unit that is supposed to be able to tell the president, no, you can't do this. One of the fascinating things in this case study is the way in which classification and secrecy are used to rewire these systems of oversight. Because of the classification and secrecy, only a small number of members of Congress, poorly staffed, can connect. And only one judge, also poorly staffed and not in the context of an actual controversy, gets brought in. The same thing happens with the OLC. So one of the things we read from this report is the following. DOJ Office of Legal Counsel Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Yoo was responsible for drafting the first series of legal memoranda supporting the program. As the only OLC official read into the PSP through early 2003, that is to say close to 2 years, you consulted directly with White House officials about the PSP, etc. When talked about, Bybee, who was his superior, said, I was surprised and a little disappointed to learn through media accounts that you had worked on PSP without his knowledge. Senior officials say, the officials noted that OLC traditionally adheres to a rigorous peer review process for all legal memoranda it issues. Not this one, too secret to read the person in. We don't know whether, as it says here in the end, Ashcroft, whether he sought additional DOJ read-ins to assist in the legal analysis or not. So what we see here again, just like we see with the earlier components I described, ways of circumventing systems. In this case, it's not legally instantiated systems, it's professional association and standards systems that are intended to prevent this. So what we see is circumventing internal independence mechanism within the executive review system. We see earlier on circumvention of professional associations and standards that can provide alternative sources of constraint, either because individuals or organizations assert them as power of a competing system. So that essentially, if on a normal basis the idea of a standard-setting organization is that that organization asserts a certain role morality and a certain organizational capacity as a counterweight to the company that sends the engineer, the government that sends the engineer, that's its purpose. Its purpose is to provide an organizational counterweight or an institutional framework that counterbalances different kinds of power. So too we see here the internal review process and professional tradition of OLC is supposed to provide what everybody understands is a very strong pull from the White House. Here it's simply rewired through the use of secrecy to undermine that basic peer review process. So then we see in this report, this is where we really in some sense learn about the remarkable events of 2004, when as soon as Yu Leaves and Philbin and Goldsmith are read into the program, there's an enormously dramatic internal revolt at how weak these memos are. There's dramatic pushback from these officials on the White House, and there's a period of battle and a short hiatus before things begin to move, and we'll go back to the timeline in a little to explicate those. But one of the first things that happens is that the presiding judge of the FISC is asked to certify the pen register and track and trace approach, which is to say the internet flow approach. But here's what we see from her remarkably redacted program. This is one of the more visible parts. The raw volume of the proposed collection is enormous. NSA that it estimates its collection will encompass blacked out. In absolute terms, the proposed surveillance will result in the collection of metadata pertaining to electronic communications of persons located within the United States who are not the subject of any FBI investigation. It will capture. The court recognizes, for reasons both constitutional authority and practical competence, deference should be given. Then she goes on to say, in this case, senior responsible officials whose judgment in these matters is entitled to deference have articulated why they believe that bulk collection and archiving of metadata are necessary to identify and monitor operatives whose internet communication would otherwise go undetected in the huge streams, etc. So what we have here is a court that systematically is incapable of assessing the core questions, which are the necessity of the particular design of the system to achieve the result, the significance of the contribution, and the importance of the result. And a court who views its own role in oversight is paying deference. As we go back to the timeline, what we see is that in the period over here, there's no law as long as Yu is insulated, and purely voluntary compliance. The Gang of Eight and the presiding judge information provide nothing, and that's the closely held period. Then there's a brief period of within-system efforts. Almost immediately, the FBI begins to issue national security letters, ultimately over 140,000. Many of them exigent letters. That is to say, yeah, we'll bring you a judicial one day, and we never do because there are exigent circumstances. These are accepted at face value by the carriers, who then turn over the raw data. And so essentially that's why I call it the quiet quiescence and a voluntary like, because it would be relatively easy to resist. Easy is complicated, because this is a period during which Quest actually does resist. And at least according to his own account, and it's a self-serving account, the CEO of Quest claims that the insider trading criminal prosecution that was brought against him was brought in retaliation to his resistance to participating. It's a very self-serving claim. I haven't seen an independent claim. It is the case that Quest did in fact resist and was the only one that was resisted. In December 2005, the New York Times publishes the story of the warrantless wiretapping from internal DOJ leaker Thomas Tam. In March of 2006, Mark Klein files an affidavit with the court in a suit against AT&T, initially under seal, later on made public, explaining the role of AT&T in enabling upstream collection at the AT&T switch. Within the span of 2 months, the full FISC for the first time is read into the telephony metadata problem and begins to require demands. Within it takes about a year for the PSP to be approved for the last time, and then Congress passes the 2007 Protect America Act and ultimately replaces it with the FISA Amendments Act. Now, this, which includes, among other things, immunity to the telcos for all of their long-term voluntary compliance, because the voluntary compliance plays a critical role throughout this. So this gives us a little bit of both stories. It gives us a story about how internal work by incredibly conscientious people inside the system pushes back, but leaves us uncertain of the extent to which this successfully prevented or changed the practices. And it produces a fairly tight time frame from the moment of the leaks and public exposure to more significant changes than we'd seen in the 4 years before, to suggest quite heavily that the public exposure played a critical role in what was otherwise a system that was self-healing and preventing its own change, even to internal resistance. Now, at long last, we come to what we started out being excited about, which was Prism and the FISA Amendments Act and the Section 215 bulk metadata collection. This is the front door access under an order to internet companies. As I said, fairly clear that the internet companies mostly were less accommodating, but nonetheless acquiesced. It's important to understand that the voluntary cooperation of the telcos was a major hack for years. What's really interesting to see is how it then feeds back into the legal system. So in late August, the administration released a FISC opinion that for the first time actually assesses the constitutionality of these programs. One of the interesting pieces of evidence that the judge here writes is, to date, no holder of records who has received an order to produce bulk telephony metadata has challenged the legality of such an order. Indeed, no recipient of any Section 215 order has challenged the legality of such an order, despite the explicit statutory mechanism for doing so. That is to say, the legal lever is in the hands not of the subject of collection, because you can't tell them because it's a secret, but in the hands of the companies that for over a decade voluntarily comply. The compliance is then used as a source of legitimacy for the claim of legality of the practice. This is the public-private partnership for surveillance at its very core. All of this is then justified on the basis that even though you collect everything, internal processes of selection assure the rights are preserved, the rights of Americans are preserved. And for this talk's purposes, I'm leaving the rights of non-Americans, because I'm really just talking about the way in which a single system of legality claims for itself the mantle of freedom. And it's a fairly sophisticated thing, and you've got FISA Amendments Act adjudicators in each product line, and you've got the FBI Electronic Communications Surveillance ULA's research validating that it's not US persons. Lots of different things go in here where the processing is all done by internal processes that then are validated as processes by the FISC. What do we know about the FISC? So in March 2009, this now is regarded to the telephony side, not to the internet side. We have the opinion that basically says the government has compounded its non-compliance with the court orders by repeatedly submitting inaccurate description of the alert list process to the FISC, describing the entire process from 2006 to 2009 as one in which systematically there is underreporting and misrepresentation. Now you'll correct it, I'll let you go on. 2 years later, Judge Bates, looking at the internet side of things, say the revelation fundamentally, this is the new revelation he's getting then, this is the program that's been operating since 2004 and the FISC approval, fundamentally alters the court's understanding of the scope of the collection conducted pursuant to Section 702. And here's an interesting footnote. The court is troubled that the government's revelation regarding NSA's acquisition of internet transactions marks the third instance in less than 3 years in which the government has disclosed a substantial misrepresentation regarding the scope of a major collection program. In March 2009, the court concluded that its authorization of NSA bulk acquisition of telephone call detail records from blank in so-called big business records matter had been premised on a flawed depiction of how the NSA uses the acquired metadata, and that this misperception by the FISC existed from the inception of its authorized collection in May 2006, buttressed by repeated inaccurate statements made in the government's submissions and despite a government-devised and court-mandated oversight regime. Contrary to the government's repeated assurances, NSA had been routinely running queries of the metadata using querying terms that did not meet the required standard for querying. The court concluded that this requirement had been so frequently and systematically violated that it can fairly be said that this critical element of the overall regime has never functioned effectively. Severe, systematic imbalance of information capacity, the ex parte nature, exacerbates, but also short of internal investigative powers, the independent advocate that is now proposed will be extremely weak. Unless they can go in and look, they still will be limited to what is disclosed. Now, it's important to recognize that this isn't necessarily a mark of bad faith. Well-intentioned habitual efforts under conditions of complexity reliably lead to systemic error and overreach in any organization. Normal processes of organizational imperfection can be a full explanation without any reference to bad intent. The point, and this is what's so difficult, the point is not 3 bad actors. The point is systemic impossibility. There's another story to be told about congressional oversight, and I won't go deeply into its details, but the basic problem is one that the constraints of secrecy prevents adequate staffing and adequate intervention by anyone other than the small select group of members of the committees. As we saw with Senators Wyden and Udall for several years, the trade-off is you get to see enough if you're a critic, but then you can't actually harness the only power you have, which is political power, because you can't talk about it. You can only make vague references. Whereas if you keep the freedom to mobilize politically, you get excluded with the knowledge to know what to attack. And that system disables the congressional oversight more than any other. So this is our problem. Liberal legality conceives of freedom as attainable through the rule of law, through institutional design. It requires proper definitions of the limits of state power. It suggests it can provide proper definitions of the operation of state power within its proper limits, the proper definition of institutional and organizational measures within the system, and these have to provide a complete remedy to failure. Either illegality or the use of illegitimate power beyond the power of the law is a failure of the law. It's what we think of as vigilante justice. It has to provide the complete answer. The problem is the assumption of factual possibility. No system sufficiently complex and open to provide freedom to plan and execute a life for as diverse and complex a creature as human beings, for whom learning and intentional change are core attributes, on a scale of millions, can be perfect. Human systems are imperfect anywhere, everywhere, at any given scale. Perfecting systems requires constraining choice, simplifying and regularizing interactions. Preserving choice and freedom requires embracing imperfection and uncertainty. Well, what do we do with that, even if we accept that it's true? That, in some sense, is the challenge. But this is not an abstract proposition. Look at what Justice Alito writes with regard to GPS tracking and whether it fills the Fourth Amendment. In the pre-computer age, the greatest protections of privacy were neither constitutional nor statutory, but practical. Traditional surveillance for any extended period of time was difficult and costly and therefore rarely undertaken. It was imperfection rather than perfection that was what he calls the greatest protection of privacy. Impossibility. So in order to understand what this means, we have to move beyond the standard model of state, civil society, and market as abstract concepts, and begin to think a little bit more as basins of attractions for much more granular systems. This is not by any stretch of the imagination a complete or necessarily accurate statement of the subsystems. Those of you who know sociologist Niklas Luhmann will recognize the echoes from differentiation of society. Huge differences. Luhmann is really focused on how the internal processes for the preservation of each of these subsystems, the autopoiesis. I'm more interested in individuals and in power across these systems. But there is some overlap between this basic conception. The idea is none of these systems are perfect. None of these systems are perfectly controllable. And the way in which we function is by weaving our way through these systems. And a critical part of our freedom is the degree to which we can move between and among these systems in order to leverage their affordances in some senses, use their constraints in others, avoid power where necessary. What we see in the NSA bulk surveillance, or the bulk surveillance, and NSA here is in some sense targeted unfairly because the FBI is every bit as much part of this as we saw with the exigent letters, as we saw with the domestic surveillance Inspectors General report, is to expand beyond the domain of the administrative bureaucratic governance across multiple other systems so as to achieve its outcome. So what we saw was rewiring of open technical systems, rewiring of professional norms-based standards and standard-setting organizations, of commercial product design, of market responsiveness of firms, of judicial mechanisms for protecting citizens and residents' privacy, of executive branch internal checks, of congressional formal oversight, and of public accountability through public debate. So that essentially what you get is, as I show here, an effort to expand the domain of influence or the power and rewire other systems to achieve an insularity, but also a capacious reach, in order, again, remember that first image, to project power across these multiple systems and to avoid the possibility that the limitation of the effective practical reach of the system is what preserves freedom of action on the other side, because freedom of action is also freedom to threaten. Again, remember, this is driven by a sense of necessity. Now, part of the problem of this is that the national security system, the president spoke of security versus liberty, but security is not an abstract concept. Security is a particular set of organizations and institutions operating within a given instantiated society. And so you have to basically see, why is this system, or is this system in any particular sense, foolproof? Why is it less likely to fail than other organizations? If we look at the way in which the requirements of this rewiring happened, one of the interesting things that happened was that after the revelations, there came to be more pressure. Senator Leahy put it. The NSA came up. There were 54 terrorist plots were foiled. It turned out these were not 54. They weren't foiled. They weren't terrorist plots. It ends up being one case that I'll talk about in a little bit, of transferring one prosecution for transferring $8,500 to Al-Shabaab is tied to telephony metadata collection as the source. But what's interesting about, and perhaps for this crowd will be most understood, is the theory of Bull Run. Remember, Bull Run is the intervention in product design and standard setting. It's a theory that assumes that a central agency will be more effective than distributed diverse efforts of both market and non-market actors at achieving security. Because what happened with the undermining of the terrorism justification was that the NSA began to put out more heavily the emphasis on cybersecurity. We're observing everything so that we can identify threats, and then we can intervene to prevent them. And that's not a state of emergency that's now, that's a state of emergency that's forever. And that justifies the $2 billion facility going on forward. Now think of it for a moment. You introduce vulnerabilities into basic systems, standards, basic commercial utilities, relying on secrecy alone to prevent exploitation, and making the NSA database as a single point of failure. That is a particular conception of security that only a general could love. Classic, centralized, hierarchical, closed model, which stands really in opposition to so much of what we've learned. And I'd be curious to see whether people agree or not. But it seems like a very particular view of security. The top line of technology, the cutting edge of technology, in a superbly stable, well-designed system that will defend the country. So why are organizations imperfect? This is not a question of government specifically. All organizations are imperfect. And we have, let's call it, at least three major families of understandings of organizational failure. Some of these flowing primarily from economics assumptions go to self-interest or principal agent or rational actor models at all levels. From trying to get ahead in life to covering your ass so that you don't lose your job at the lower level to the revolving door and empire building at the top level. This is the idea that individuals try to maximize their own goals even at the expense of the goal. So you can imagine this as an empire building emphasis or something like that. But you don't have to be skeptical about the intentions of human beings to recognize that there are internal organizational dynamics, routines, habits, and practices that typify all hierarchical organizations. Learning is hard for all organizations. Habits of mind dominate. And the logic of mid-management that you don't give the boss bad news is pervasive. This is a problem that it doesn't matter if you'll go to a management school and they'll deal with a big company trying to learn how to innovate, or you go to a public administration school and try to understand how you move from more traditional command and control systems to more open systems that actually allow engagement of stakeholders. This is a classic problem. It's a problem that's exacerbated dramatically by the secrecy. Because all of the classes of solutions that we know to these problems depend on opening up. Well, most of them, not all of them. Sometimes you can have internal skunk works and all sorts of things like that that are inside or outsiders. And particularly in the context of national security under a perceived threat, is you have the behavioral dynamics, the psychological dynamics. Particularly here, the availability heuristic, things you see all the time, the threats you see all the time take a certain degree of importance, and loss aversion. You're much more likely to worry about massive loss, even if it's very remote, than about the persistent set of limitations that are not in your bailiwick. What bulk surveillance does, it expands the reach of the executive power generally and the national security criminal enforcement in particular, which is particularly dangerous under a state of emergency mindset, where you believe that it's temporary and so it's not going to influence the long term, and B, you believe that if you don't do it, you die and many people die. And it's particularly dangerous under the state of some emergency in which we exist, or in which we understand ourselves as existing, which essentially is self-perpetuating. It's global, it's omnipresent, it's ill-defined, and it mutates all the time. Importantly here, the executive power is expanded by combining universal visibility with loose, vague laws, and that's how we get the chilling effect. Essentially, as a practical matter, not through actual reach, but through internal self-control, the effect, or the feared effect of bulk surveillance is that the executive national security components of the state begin to influence the behavior throughout all of these systems. They encapsulate all of them because they have visibility into all of them, or at least, more accurately, this is the panopticon effect, the Bentham designed prison. The fact that we can reasonably believe that anything we say or do or search can be visible under some circumstances controls behavior internally. And internalized control behavior on the positive side is exactly why we're seeing open innovation and non-proprietary innovation go everywhere, because we understand that systems are imperfect at incentivizing innovation. But this is the negative side of the same phenomenon, internal self-policing. As Justice Sotomayor wrote in the same opinion, awareness that the government may be watching chills associational and expressive freedoms, and the government's unrestrained power to assemble data that reveal private aspects of identity is susceptible to abuse. That's the core point. So what are the components? As I said, there was one case that actually pans out as in support of bulk telephony metadata. That's the case of Basali Mu'alin. Phone conversations, metadata from phone conversations of whom was used to identify 5 Somali immigrants who, across several times, successfully transferred $8,500 to Al-Shabaab within the first 3 or 4 months after Al-Shabaab was put on the terrorist watch list. And I won't go into more about the fact that that is the only prevented terrorism that actually has been shown. What's interesting for our purposes here is that this is under material support to a terrorist organization. as we know from the Supreme Court's opinion in Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, that covers everything, including sending people to a terrorist organization that's not involved in any way, shape, or form with battles with the US to help them understand peaceful dispute resolution mechanisms. It's up to the administration to decide whether support there counts. It can cover everything. The other thing that we see is that terrorism outside of material support is also highly flexible in its definition. It involves any kind of power, or a relatively broad definition of power aimed at political uses. We've seen, again, in the Inspector General's report on domestic terrorism, or terrorism investigations against domestic adversary groups, that it included, for example, even before the FISA Amendments Act, Greenpeace cutting ice roads created by BP in Alaska, because that was in some form or another threatening a pipeline. And on top of all of this, the continuous use of conspiracy changes the rules of evidence and changes the rules of what counts as exactly permissible, such that you get an incredibly broad funnel of activities by lots of people other than the particular target, at times when the person wasn't even part of the story, to build into what they were doing. So very, very broad and vague set of rules. And what you get is essentially universal data access and storage, plus vague laws provide rich ground for abuse. So here's one story, the Thomas Merton Center, that comes out of the IG report on domestic advocacy groups. Essentially what happens is a fresh FBI recruit has a boring afternoon. Their supervisor sends them out to sort of sniff out a local anti-war project, a local anti-war protest. Embarrassing to come back and say, I didn't find anything. So files an international terrorism report just in case and takes a photo of someone. Embarrassing in the draw, big deal. 3 years later, a FOIA request threatens to reveal this terrorism report unintentionally, not knowing about it. So the staff go back in and start looking in the databases to find a particular person that is somehow remotely associated with this, or with an organization that is associated with the organization that was organizing the story. Then finds another statement about that person from a field office in a different state, and recreates the reasonably articulable suspicion to begin with, and begins to send that up the chain of command through the press releases, so that it ends up with the director of the FBI representing the Congressional Oversight that that's what's happened on that day. That's what happens when you have universal data collection and storage with sufficiently vague categories in organizations that have their own internal dynamics for trying to operate. No deep evil, just normal error, incompetence, and malfeasance. The primary threatened population in this decade are Muslims through material support and terrorism, critics of the national security industrial complex itself, particularly transparency-focused activists through espionage, computer security laws, and classification system protection. We see this in the criminal campaign against national security leakers critical of the administration, only critical of the administration. Right, so you see things like Binney, Weber, Rourke, and Drake, who went inside the approved channels, inside the NSA, and then were prosecuted and investigated in ways that were deeply scary, and in Drake's case ultimately resulted in an unrelated prosecution to which he pled guilty to a misdemeanor as a way of punishing leaking. Computer activists, because of the play in the joints in the CFAA and the increasing use of cybersecurity as a stand-in for terrorism as the new perpetual emergency that justifies all of this, and highly activated subversives, again because of the very broad definition of terrorism that began to be introduced after Timothy McVeigh. So these are the primary threatened populations. Let me try to finish up by bringing this to the question that I promised in the beginning, which is the question of freedom, systems, and conscience. So here we are. Human beings are in systems everywhere. Regularized interactions among entities and processes that increase the predictability for connecting cause to effect in particular action to outcome. These systems, by this increased predictability, provide affordances and constraints, by which I mean regularities that lead human agents to understand that an action within a system is feasible or infeasible and will likely or likely not lead to a desired outcome. And that's just a claim that's descriptive about the needs we have for the systems we inhabit to exhibit these regularities so that we can actually have some form of planning which is foundational to what it is to be an autonomous, self-directing, self-authoring person. Freedom in this context is capacity to plan and execute a life plan. This is a model of autonomy and freedom that I've been working with really since the late 90s. The critical point here is that autonomy is not free unfree. It's capable of capacity. It's how free. And formal legal liberties are one important potential model and potential dimension, addressing one common class of constraints within the large political system that has been central to human action, what we call as the state. But it's one such system, and it's far from covering either the full set of threats and constraints that are relevant from a first-person perspective to being able to plan and execute your life, nor is it a complete solution to those problems. There's no freedom without systems. It's not that if we had somehow no systems or we eliminated them, we would be more free. Because then you can't plan, like walking without gravity. Liberal legality offers only partial answers. The problems with the primary sort of radical alternatives, libertarianism and anarchism, is that they're both incomplete. Right? Libertarianism somehow assumes that the market exists independent of the systems, but it is itself a system full of constraints and affordances. And anarchism doesn't actually accept the problems with scalability of voluntary mutualism and doesn't recognize the recreation of systems of power within these cooperative systems. So systems are everywhere. Some of them libertarians like, some of them progressives like, but they're everywhere with us and we can't do without them. They've been around ever since we've tried to feed ourselves. They've been around when we tried to get rid of smallpox. And they're around in the very basis of material welfare and the ability to pursue a life. They also are constraining, and we know this. Right? They're also constraining everywhere, whether it's in the system of production, the system of cultural reproduction. What we have essentially are opposing paradigms of systems. Systems that accept complexity, uncertainty, and change versus systems that try to make the conditions predictable with calculable risk and well-behaved change. Systems that accept and assume diversity, experimentation, and innovation as opposed to systems that try to optimize for control, efficiency, and stability. Systems that are designed to be adaptive, learning, and late binding as opposed to planned and optimized. Systems that are loosely coupled as opposed to tightly coupled. Systems that are open if we try to find a shorthand for all of these as opposed to systems that are closed. This we see reoccurring as a model of thinking about systems, whether we're talking about markets and firms, whether we're talking about innovation systems that are opened or closed, whether we're talking about governance systems that are more experimental, adaptive, and learning as opposed to classical government command and control, whether we're talking about social cultural models, liberalism or looking for new things versus traditionalism, open societies versus multiple dimensions of constraint, traditional, hierarchical, none of which mean ill faith. They are different conceptions of understanding the feasibility of the project of perfecting a system, as opposed to accepting its imperfections and building for continuous change, complexity, uncertainty, and imperfection. There's a reason that people who are so deeply embedded within networked society and networked culture see Edward Snowden's act as profoundly freedom-enhancing, as heroic. Because people whose life and conceptual framework lives within the open system that we've learned to embrace on the net are on that side of the divide of these systems. Whereas the systems that are the Maginot Line are the closed systems. And the systems that try to protect themselves and their own ways of doing this and understand their full perfectibility as achievable internally see it as a threat. And that's one of the core cultural conflicts. One of the things that we're seeing now in the right-left political realignment around this question is that it's not about right-left. It's about establishment and anti-establishment in its various forms, whether it's civil libertarian, whether it's libertarian, whether it's just anti-current establishment because it's politically inconvenient. But that's now the alignment. It's a lot. I have a lot more to say. Let me burden you for a few more minutes, and then we'll open it up. Speaking of open and closed and hierarchical, but let's put that aside. At least I can say I'm a guest and invited, so it's not entirely an act of power. Let's try to think of power descriptively in a way that's usable in the design of systems. Let's think of it as the capacity of one entity to alter the behaviors and configurations or outcomes of another, measured in terms of probabilities of deviations from a baseline of preferred behaviors, configurations, or outcomes. So A1 has power over A2 to the extent that A1 can act through the given set of systems that convert the power in a way that increases the probability that A2 will behave or inhabit configurations or obtain outcomes that A1 prefers rather than B1 prefers. That's the basic idea. So we can think of people as having power and susceptibility, and freedom as being the corollary of someone having no power over you, occurring across domains of behavior, whether it's in the shaping of preferences, policies, and principles, or actions, or outcomes, as well as configuration of the systems that people inhabit, which themselves in turn determine the affordances and constraints, even if they don't directly affect the outcomes or the behavior. And we can think of systems as having two major properties, completeness or tight and loose coupling, in the sense that the extent to which if any entity is properly characterized as in a system, the dynamics of that system determine the behavior or outcomes of the entities so influenced. That is to say, the degree to which if you're inside it, it determines the outcome as opposed to influences it in less determinate ways. And closed versus open is the extent to which an entity inside or outside the system can leave or join that system. Freedom in this context can be understood as bobbing and weaving between systems and constraints and affordances that allow individuals or groups to dodge the power plays of some and exert their own power in pursuit of their own goals, both within systems and between systems. So again, if this is the image you have of the way in which the regularities of society organize themselves, these are the systems that provide us a degree of predictability such that we can plan and others can plan for us and about us, that we can contest and have some predictability of outcomes, then freedom depends in a critical way on the way in which we can flow between these systems and locate our behaviors, our perceptions, our actions, and our outcomes through these various systems. So the relationship of technology. There's a certain escapism in the technology of transportation rather than reformation in the classic cultural image of it. Reforming and moving operates within the system of law and government in the broad cultural perspective. The interesting thing about the contemporary conception is the idea of the legibility of all of these systems, the legibility and writability of all of these systems, that they're all susceptible to conscientious intervention that rewrites them. And that is where we see a change from escapism to engagement, not only through the particular prescribed modes of change, but through changing the basic configurations of the systems. Becomes a domain of imagined action that's new. And the question is, what's an individual to do in the face of persistent imperfection? And what's the system designer to do in the face of persistent imperfection on one hand and individual action on the other? So you repeatedly hear, we can't have every private first class like Manning or private contractor like Snowden decide what to declassify. But we're also kidding ourselves if we think that one more set of minimization rules or judicial reforms will secure freedom from the kinds of power expansion that typify early 21st century national security state of America. It's just not going to happen. So what do we do? As individuals, what do we do as a system? We need to start understanding what are acts of conscience by individuals, and I think it's important for us to recognize that there's a range of actions that relates to the range of ways in which systems can be moved, both within the system and external. So one modality of individual action is leveraging affordances, veto points to effect change at the control level when you can achieve it within the system. I think that's very much what Philbin and Goldsmith tried to do in 2004 when they were read into the program and tried to push internally to make the changes in the way that the program was run with only very limited success. You can use within systems prescribed mechanisms that are designed to break bad patterns. So these are inside the system itself. This is what Binney, etc., tried to do within the NSA around Trailblazer, and that's the internal whistleblowing mechanisms. You can use system-defining boundaries to constrain the scope and scale. So there are parts of the definition of the system are at the boundary. This is what resistance to subpoena that we've heard about. This is refusal or conscientious objection, like we saw with LavaBit. But it's also breaching the system boundaries to recruit power from other systems. And that's what we saw with Tam, with Klein, with Snowden, with the effort to basically breach the boundary of the system to reach outside and change the configuration of powers operating on the system from the outside. We can also have between systems. You can have leveraging super systems that entail coverage. This is litigation and legislation. A critical aspect is building workarounds from within other subsystems as external constraints on the subsystem expansion by leveraging affordances of other subsystems. What does that mean? When Google says, or when Yahoo says, we'll start encrypting our internal cloud data to prevent this. When you use Tor, when you start developing encryption systematically and you say, let's all adopt it, that's what I mean. But also professional associations and professional ethics, and they're saying, I'm here over here, I'm invoking these rules to prevent, I can't do it in that particular form. And recruiting external subsystems as counterpower. This is essentially what the journalists have done. The image of Alan Rusbridger sitting in front of the British Parliament, explaining himself and why it's not exactly that he's supporting terrorism is shocking. But it requires an act of conscience. The thing to see is the system designers see two very different classes. One of these things that are prescribed within, and one of things that are not. And these others, the question is how you respond to them. And what we've seen historically is that we've seen initial efforts to suppress these efforts to break the boundary and break the prescribed systems, and then rollback. So whether it's in the case of the press, we have a very stark separation between freedom of the press and the traitor treatment of the whistleblowers. It's a completely artificial distinction. Yes, you can say about there was this agreement, there was that agreement, there was insight, there was a duty of trust or another. But fundamentally, if the idea of freedom of the press is that you need an external, independent source of criticism that can leverage the power of the polity to counterweigh the internal dynamics of the political system or of the administrative system in order to control them, and that you starkly disallow the state to go after the press, then you can't have a similarly stark approach to the whistleblowers on the other side. That's like saying you can make clay bricks, but you can't have clay. It doesn't work. So what we need is a way for the system to accept that what the people down there are doing is also part of the necessary set of mechanisms for system reconfiguration. It's continuous, not discontinuous. And that needs to be the approach. Legality and prescribed processes will necessarily run out and be incomplete and imperfect. The claim of completeness and the ambition to limit responses to prescribed or within system actions is authoritarian at its core. It tries to capture everything. Freedom is best understood as practical navigation between and within systems. And freedom is itself a practical concept in actual instantiated systems. There's no complete escape to value-neutral models or processes between within system prescribed and between system mechanisms. They're all part of the same practical dimension. System compliance, just do what the system says, offers an incomplete answer to the ethical question, what shall I do? Because the within system values are incomplete. It's also an incomplete answer to the political question of how shall we organize our affair. In particular, how shall we treat dissenters and objectors? There is no single system to preserve freedom. There are no fixed models or ideal guarantees of freedom, not a perfectly free market, not perfect civil rights, not a perfect constitutional democracy or an ideal speech situation of one form or another. All there are actual instantiated systems with persistent and diverse imperfections that require continuous learning, sensing, change, and adaptation. Incompleteness, imperfection, continual practical updating and adaptation. These are a feature, not a bug, of how we are to be free under conditions of complex modern societies, typified by uncertainty, unintended effects, and change. This system, this image captures a remarkable moment. And we focus on the enormous conscience of that individual standing in front of the tank. But it also captures the driver of the tank. And ironically, it also captures the driver of the fifth tank. He says, oh, let me go. There's a line. Let me go stand in line. So this one person can stand. This tension between humanity and the systems it occupies is absolutely central to understanding how we can be free. This came to mind to me, and then it turned out that it was only translated into English in '98. Where I grew up in Israel, this German language poem by Bertolt Brecht was practically required reading for everyone. Perhaps we had more that we needed to think from it. So let me finish by just reading it to you. General, your tank is a powerful vehicle. It smashes down forests and crushes 100 men, but it has one defect. It needs a driver. General, your bomber is powerful. It flies faster than a storm and carries more than an elephant, but it has one defect. It needs a mechanic. General, man is very useful. He can fly and he can kill, but he has one defect. He can think. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Yochai. It's fascinating, very thought-provoking. I have a sort of question about how significant are the changes that have happened in the last, since the turn of the century, in terms of these issues. So presumably the limitations, the possibility of organizations to fail has always been there. The possibility of checks and balances to fail, limitations of liberal legality have always been there, and the possibility, and it's presumably many different cases in the past where units inside the government have rewired to go around the supposed constraints. And so I guess in your presentation, some of the changes that have occurred that you referred to, one is with technology providing the possibility of trying to exert perfect control, and then the other are the threats of terrorism and cybersecurity. And I guess my question is, do you think these are fundamental changes that make, say, liberal legality unable to deal with the kind of sorts of problems that it presumably has always had?
So that's an absolutely fabulous question that I think is central. The changes of the 21st century go to the particular class of failure that we're observing here. I don't think they go to the fundamental question of the limitations of liberal legality as the primary modality of freedom. I do think they go to some extent to some classes of solutions that we can overcome. So let me unpack what I just said. The basic impossibility of perfect human systems was there all along. There's a period intellectually in organizational thinking that imagines the possibility of more perfect this theory of scientific management and the idea that you can, through complete measurement of everything, be able to actually control systems perfectly. Roughly 2/3, let's say, of the first 2/3 of the 20th century. It translates to some extent into the idea of the welfare state and social democracy and the administrative state. In some places it's more about administration, in some places it's more about business. It's wrong, but it's ascendant conceptually and in terms of instantiated systems. During that time, we also have the development of a political theory that is very much based in rights, based in and a fear of redistribution, pushing for more revolutionary or contrary forces, so that we get the development of liberal theories that are intended to accept the completeness of the solution of law and the completeness of the definition of freedom in terms of freedom from the state through civil rights, setting aside the questions of justice and practical capacity to act in the world given constraints. Part of what's happened in the last, I wouldn't say even 13 years, but let's call it quarter century, is to some extent it's the collapse of the Soviet Union and the model of the communist state as a stable alternative that then emphasizes a state-based and problematic for its own purposes form of redistribution as a modality of freedom as opposed to legality. So that opens up the possibility. The big change technologically on the feasibility side is, and this is really a lot of what the work that I did, still am doing, but mostly up until 7-8 years ago, is the practical capacity to do things in ways that are neither firms nor states, nor based in market, nor based in hierarchies. And so the solution space of purely voluntary action, what we might think of as classically anarchistic, is become larger. So that certain kinds of solutions that required large-scale systems before no longer require large-scale organized systems, and that means that you can loosen the requirement of things happening in a small number of relatively simplified large-scale systems and can open up more adaptive practices that are more fluid as a way of a solution space. So the practical implementation has become easier of mechanisms of becoming free, which in turn makes the theoretical question of how we understand freedom given these new set of practical capabilities more important. The particular threat does have this combination of, on one hand, the perfect visibility possibility and the amorphous state of emergency that at the same time increase the claims of the state and its capacity to exercise much more power than it could in the past. So you have this change in practical background conditions that increases the potential power and the claims of legitimacy of the power of the state, while at the same time increasing the possibilities of other systems playing a sufficiently large role that they become a substantial alternative locus of action. Yeah, Dorothy.
I look forward to reading it. It's going to take a lot.
I look forward to writing it.
Unpacking, as they say. Thank you very, very much. I wanted to go back. In 1971, I served on a whistleblowing committee, 5 people in Washington, from which Earl Warren was one of the members. It was quite an experience. And I learned 2 things. One is, if you prepared to leave your job. And number two, Earl Warren, in the midst of a very theoretical discussion, leaned across the table and poked his finger at the person who was giving a paper and said, tell me, how is this fellow feeding his family? And I've never forgotten that kind of, let's get down to where it is. And so I'm going to ask you, if you were teaching an 8th grade civics class, how would you describe Snowden?
There are reasons I teach only graduate students, but some things are easier for me than others. I think he's a person of conscience. I think he's somebody who saw things that he saw were wrong, who understood that he was undertaking an enormous risk and that he was sacrificing a major part of what he understood to be his future life, and was willing to make that sacrifice because what he saw was what he believed is wrong. What he did ended up opening a conversation that allows us, for the first time in 15 years really, since September 11th, to look in the mirror and say, have we gone too far? Has our understanding of ourselves as being in a continuous state of war that allows an ever more muscular state gone so far that we really need a fundamental reassessment? And in that regard, he is likely to be a person with a major historical impact. Does that translate to 8th grade, or does that respond to what it is that you were?
Okay, well, my father said he committed treason.
Well, it could be true.
Yeah, and that's the point. And how do you get that across? How do you get that point across to kids for whom it's very hard to deal with bilateral or binomial or ambiguous situations? And so I guess I wanted to hear your balance. You can't have 100% security and 100% privacy. Of how do you present to young people the sense that both are right?
I don't think treason is right, period. I think potential threat. I think it's entirely plausible for someone to make the claim that the choice he made was a wrong choice in terms of weighing the threats to security of the United States to the threats from the national security system that the American state faces. Those two someone could disagree with. Treason requires a certain willfulness to harm the country, to help an enemy. What you have here is a deep act of self-sacrifice to inform the public so that it can turn around and say, not in our names. So as long as you're in a democratic society, as long as the act is to say, no, I'm going to give this to an enemy, I'm going to somehow disclose this in a way that will undermine the security of the nation, it isn't treason. And I think you can't escape making the judgment on the facts. You can't say there's a clear way. You're either a traitor or you fulfill the law. You have to see what actually has been said, what actually happened. What we found as a practical matter is that the system we believed was protecting our privacy hasn't really been working. The courts and the Congressional Oversight, all the things that we're taught in the 8th grade civics book about how the system functions actually weren't working properly because of the secrecy, because of the sense of emergency. And so in order to recover those, we need to know what's going on. And you can't have a democracy without knowing what's going on.
I have I think a follow-up to both those questions, because first, thank you, that was really a fascinating presentation. I think I understood most of it. What I didn't understand was your answer to that very important first question.
Maybe because I was looking at Salil and had my back to you, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. It was just more abstract an answer than I was able to grapple with, because I function in the world of liberal legalism, and I think I share this with a number of people, a real sense of despair about what can be done within that world because of the way technology has just qualitatively changed what it is that the state is capable of doing, how it's capable of exercising power. These are old stories, but it's never had the kind of technological capacity that it has now. You know, Hoover was working literally with index cards in a little box. And, you know, my sense is that pushing back on this is not going to take, certainly not going to start with legalistic liberalism. That the answer is only going to be more technology, which, you know, I don't really understand. But I don't see where the role is right now for legal reform, because one lesson of history is that when an executive amasses power, it never gives it up. It really never gives it up. I mean, it can be leashed in certain ways, as it was with the Church Report, but, you know, there was no qualitative change, and usually the leashing comes after there's some major scandal that affects, if not majorities, then really critical minorities of the populace, so that there's enough pushback. And it's a little hard for me to imagine that happening now. And I also wanted to follow up on Dorothy's question, pointing out the enormous courage and sacrifice it takes for people to make these individual acts of conscience, because then you have to go as far as standing in front of a tank. And there's so much in the rest of the culture that teaches and encourages people not to do that. And they can do it more effectively in groups, and that's why you have political rallies and political groups. But again, the power of technology and surveillance is having a significant chilling effect on that, and the power of law. If you look at, say, even the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which defines nonviolent acts by animal rights activists as terrorism. So, can you give us a better, more hopeful, concrete answer to all this?
No. I think part of what I am trying to do with this project is give us a way to understand, but also to map and plan a project of continual struggle, because there is no machine that will go of itself. What there is continuous tussle, continuous learning, and learning of new models. I don't agree that legal interventions are necessarily useless. That was not the import of what I was trying to present here. I think the Church Committee bought us a quarter of a century. Not perfect, but it bought us a quarter of a century, and it got destabilized by the conjoining of both the technological revolution and the geopolitical revolution that upended the system. I don't know, I don't think it offered a complete solution, and I don't think that it will offer a complete solution. But I also, in the flip side, I also don't think that, oh, let's just encrypt everything and that will solve the problem. I don't think the state has perfect power through technology and law. I don't think individuals or subjects or society or whatever the set of people you're trying to protect have complete solutions through the state or technology. I think what you do is, as individuals, and this is why really for the first time I'm trying to connect the question, the ethical question of what should I do? Well, if I know how to code, I should code. If I know how to do law, then I should do law, and I should find the ways in which I can do it. If I know something particularly urgent, then I have that knowledge, and I become the whistleblower if I can. Though I would never presume to criticize someone who doesn't take on that risk and isn't willing to make that kind of sacrifice. It's an enormous sacrifice. So I would say aiming for legal reform that slows down, changes the direction, makes it more likely for the next scandal to actually change things, is a set of legal interventions that's a plausible set of interventions. That's why I tried to put together the list of types of interventions people can make that are acts of individual conscience within the capabilities and context in which they exist, which is a completely different statement than saying either all technology will solve it or all democracy will solve it, or it's not a matter of one solution, one great effort now. It's a question of continuous effort. It's a question of not so much continuous, but punctuated effort. Right? You move something to create certain practices and habits and routines within an organization, an institution, a technology that then stabilizes a certain pattern of behavior. And then you wait for the next time that it gets destabilized so that you can nudge it in the right direction or avoid it being nudged in the wrong direction. But that's the only answer. The only answer is to continuously scan the environment and identify threats and identify opportunities to make things better in whatever subsystem you happen to have the competence or context in which you can act.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
So let's thank Yochai again.
Thank you.